Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and today we're reviewing Wretches, a trade paperback I picked up this week, uh, pretty spontaneously. I don't know any of the people that worked on this book. I don't really know anything about the publisher, Scout Comics, but I saw that this trade was going to be the first volume in a series that I knew nothing about, and I thought it'd be fun to check it out. We've done a couple of these random dives into indie books from publishers we haven't reviewed before in the last month or two, and I thought we'd give it another try with Wretches. Unfortunately, up until now, I really hadn't had a lot of success. Black Stars Above, and a couple of the other indie ones we reviewed more recently, like Seven Secrets by Tom Taylor, just really didn't speak to me in a particular way. And I was worried it was going to be the same story with Wretches, which, to be honest, has a little bit of time it needs to take before it really starts to cook and jive as a series. But by the time we get to the later issues, um, around 4, 5, and 6, I'm really digging this series and would probably recommend it. It really speaks to something I was talking about in Tom Taylor's new series, Seven Secrets, which I reviewed only the first issue of. I talked then about how I kind of wish for that series I had waited for the first full trade to come out, because a collection of several issues like this here is a lot easier to get a sense of whether the series is good or not, especially in a brand new franchise. And that was absolutely true of Wretches. If I had just gone issue by issue, I probably wouldn't have gotten into the series nearly as strongly or even necessarily at all to the point where I was really enjoying it. Meaning that I needed those 3 issues all in one set to start to appreciate what they're going for, really start to get a sense of the characters, and to start to really get into this story. Now, it makes sense for something like Robert Kirkman's firepower to be able to put out a trade right out of the gate, which I thought was a great idea. Someone like Tom Taylor or other big name writers working for relatively big name indie publishers like Boom Studios, Image Comics, Dark Horse, all of those bigger name companies, they have the resources to be able to put out a trade, but it's a lot of work. And for what is really just a little indie team putting together something with a company I never even heard of before, which might just be my relative lack of knowledge of indie books, but that's a lot more work. And if you read the back little bit of credits, the creative team had been working on this book since 2015, and a lot of them really started out back in 2012. You can kind of tell, actually, the earlier issues are a little dated in how they feel, and it does kind of read to me like a series developed back in 2015, but even with roots in 2012, because it has a couple of little older sensibilities, the way some characters are drawn, the way some stories are told. It reads like a lower tier indie book, which is fine, because that's what it is. But because of the amount of work that goes into these books and the relative lack of resources, I really can't appreciate the hustle and the effort that it took to get published, and how damn good this thing looks given that struggle, and how much of an achievement this book's very existence is, and how nice it ended up being. This is a good, thick book, nicely published, and is just full of excellent artwork. I think mostly thanks to Chunlin Zhao, who does the coloring. It's a very colorful book with a lot of different settings, and she does a good job in making this little universe feel dynamic as we go to different planets and very much enjoy a spacefaring adventure. James E. Roche is the writer. He's done a bunch of Transformers books for IDW and stuff, but this seems to be like his own personal creation. Salo Farias does the artwork, before the coloring, and he has a strong sense of identity and direction. It took me a little while to win me over because the characters are very exaggerated in their drawings. I can see it in the cover displayed right now, where everything's like the guys are overly muscular and the lady characters are super sexy drawn. But it's a style that he's going for. It's consistently drawn. It's a little weird just because A, we have a lot of weird stuff going on with robots, but B, the aliens are drawn differently than that, and they have a lot of detail and thought put into them. And in comparison, they're a lot more realistically drawn by human standards compared to the humans, which is a strange choice. But I digress, and it kind of fits in with the overall series and even the overall kind of lower level indie aesthetic that I was talking about that exists in the writing. So I don't hate it. And then Chas Pangburn did the lettering. It's pretty standard lettering, but I think that's a good thing. It doesn't try to do anything super fancy. It does do something nice where the aliens each talk in different styles of lettering depending on their species, and because they're all just different races, they each kind of have a distinct voice, but it's not too overplayed. It helps so that you have a sense of who's speaking, though. And the book as a whole, I quite enjoyed. If you're kind of like me and missing Saga, which has been on hiatus for years now, and there are stuff out there like Outer Darkness and Invisible Kingdom, which kind of fill that niche, but those books are sort of going for their own thing and feel like very distinct entries. Wretches is not Saga. It's not that good because you don't have blockbuster talent like Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples working on it. It's more of an underdog, but it has a lot of potential, cool ideas and aesthetics, and I would totally recommend you check out the trade. I also, and this was kind of interesting, was pleased to learn that it's going to be adapted into a TV show because it reminds me kind of books like Kick-Ass, The Boys, Umbrella Academy, which are good graphic novels, but a little rough around the edges, which is exactly how I define this book. And it feels like the kind of fodder for excellent adaptation. And I would really like to see this universe adapted into a TV show or something like that. Because there's a lot of potential out there, and a lot of it is largely unexplored out of this book, but in a good way. There's a lot of history to this world, a sense of culture and differences between various races, the robots, and the humans. And I would like to see more of this universe, especially on a base level. There's a certain aesthetic that I really like. It's a weird mix of like steampunk, Mad Max, various sci-fi franchises, including some that I've already mentioned that it reminds me of, but a lot of Star Wars for sure, and even like itty bitty chunks of Farscape and Firefly. Now, that's a lot of different sci-fi franchises, so what I'm really describing there is an original idea. It does kind of resemble various sci-fi franchises over the years, but it does enough things differently and not truly unique to any one of those other franchises that it is something kind of worth checking out on its own. That being said, it is no Saga, or even Invisible Kingdom, or Outer Darkness. It isn't really a Star Wars or anything like that. But it's different enough that I think it's okay. Because, yeah, it doesn't quite live up to any of those things in terms of excitement or raw quality. But in terms of potential and interesting ideas, cool aesthetics I haven't really seen anywhere else, this does a pretty good job. Now, I haven't talked at all about what this book is about, so let's get into that a little bit. I don't think I'm going to do a full me going through everything that happens in this book, because for one thing, this is a collection of 6 issues, so it's rather complicated. But another, I'd rather leave some of that unspoiled. I think this book is worth a purchase and is worth checking out enough that it's not justified for me to spoil every single little thing. But I will say this, it's about 2 siblings named Shay and Sean. They exist as sort of something between bounty hunters and scrapyard collectors. They hunt down these robots that clearly have rebelled, but the robots are one of the most interesting parts of the entire 6 issues. They they read a lot like fugitives or something like that. They live in this station where all their buildings, like there's all these buildings just sort of cobbled together and it floats through space. They don't really have a lot of security there because no one really cares. They're all burnt out. They used to basically be immortal and could be regularly upgraded and repaired, but that's all gone now, and they basically have had to flee their home, while every other biological race in the universe shuns them. Now that I'm saying it all out loud, it's sort of a similar situation to the Geth in the Mass Effect franchise, but these robots are written and treated very differently. We are introduced to the main robot character in a dive bar with his buddy, and they're just shocking themselves in a way that's very comparable to them being addicted to drugs and just getting really high. It's interesting because we keep going back to that bar, and you kind of get to know the barkeep and a couple of regulars there. They're pretty cool characters. There's a lot of cool character work here that kind of wins me over. She and Sean have a lot of particular history with these robots, and a couple of the main character robots, including the primary antagonist of this story, that's quite moving and really sold me on these characters. Because you see them as little kids and they're cute, and it does a lot to win you over. But that doesn't happen until pretty far into this trade and gets into what I was saying about like it's really valuable to pick up the trade as opposed to individual issues. At only $20 US, it wasn't like an explosive cost either. I found it quite reasonable of a price and worth that price of admission. So Sean ends up captured by some of these robots, and it really is just about Shia kind of hunting them down, and Sean dealing with this capture, and their respective journeys and finding each other across it. What I like about it is by the end of this trade, they do meet up again and they are reunited. It's not just like that's going to be the arc of this entire series. That's what this particular story arc is about, and there's so much room to explore other things, to further explore these robots who aren't exactly left completely hostile because they're individual beings that some are not overly hostile to humans, others kind of are. Some are kind of worn down over the years and really not making a lot of sense in their decision making. So they're complicated. I really like them. They're written in a very, we'll say, human way, but a very kind of individualistic and complicated way. They're not overpowered to oblivion. They're very killable, and that kind of just makes them like the human race. The human race is pretty interesting too because they're just sort of cordoned off on this desert planet and like clearly barely surviving and a target of other aliens who are better off than the human race. And we don't get a lot of sense of that. I did a little bit of research, and I think there's a different story written by Roche that does kind of get into the history of this universe a bit. But to be honest, I liked this book where all the history was incidental. The robots refer to their homeworld of Phanes, but we don't know a lot about what exactly happened there. And I think that is what's kind of covered in a past work of Roche. The humans have their history and they're clearly not well off, but we don't really get into that too much. What I would wish, though, is a world like that, that's going to be a different kind of sci-fi world, and it's going to have very different dialogue than what we actually get, which is a little too pop culture-y and gets into where I'm saying it's a little rough around the edges. I feel like if you had top-tier people work on this and make this within a year, today, this series would look and feel a little different than it does. But, like I said, that's understandable when you think about the market and how much work it takes to put out a book like this. When you don't have this as like an income coming in or anything like that, and you're kind of like Rush probably paid for this whole thing out of pocket. The artists probably weren't making a lot of money out of this and were doing this as a passion thing. It's a huge achievement to get 6 issues out and put it all out as a trade. So I don't begrudge them for doing this and having to put these issues out individually and having to work towards something over years and years. But, it is felt because of that. And I think it's worth being honest about that and kind of explaining why this book reads a little bit like that and why it takes like 6 issues to really get going. And it makes sense to me, and I still recommend it given all of that. Like, this book's a huge struggle, and to get I don't really know the full story of how it got distributed as a trade in Diamond, but that's not easy to do, and it is a remarkable achievement and is well earned. This book was pretty great on the whole. Artoria Pendragon, you did it free. Thanks for joining us. No worries about being quote unquote late. We're just here to talk about a fun indie comic. And yeah, on the whole, it's nice and bright and colorful. A lot of cool artwork. It's not grim dark, but it's still a very roguish world where people are murdering each other. The main characters are quite brutal and in some ways like selfish and unforgiving at first, and their little story arc is earned, I feel, as they kind of find meaning, and it's not anything overly complicated. There's nothing overly complicated in all of this, but there is something to it all. Revisiting those robots for a second, there's one character that talks a little bit about how her people are programmed, and they're given a backstory where they have this history of being raised by parents and a childhood that never really happened. They were built a certain way, but they're given these thoughts to sort of program them hard with emotions, and that's why I was saying they're written so individually and emotionally, and they do stuff like they don't guard their city at all, really, because they don't care, because they're people, for lack of a better word. And she talks, like this character talks about how she's very aware about how her memories are fake, but they guide her through a lot of things because they give her life meaning and they give her attachments. And she even kind of challenges the nature of human memory and how it's really not any more concrete than what she experiences. And I think there's a very valid point under all of that. What I like about it, though, is that's a little moment across a big book where they really aren't slamming these things over your head. These characters are like scavengers, drug addicts, all of these things. They're not really level-headed. They don't ruminate on politics or philosophy very much. A lot of that stuff largely exists in the background of all of this, and I think it's all the stronger for it. Like I said, because I said this book's a little rough around the edges, but a little rough. I really should clarify, because beyond that, it actually does a lot of little things right, and it doesn't make the mistakes that other books like this would make, or pratfalls they would go in certain directions. For example, this book isn't dominated by narration or flashbacks or anything like that. There's little bits of both of those things, and they're valuable when they're employed. But like I was saying about how they don't overly flesh out the history of this universe, even if they've clearly thought about that stuff. They don't bog us down in one particular setting over another. We get like the planet humans are living on, the robot city, a couple of alien worlds. It feels like a nice flesh experience across this trade. So, a pretty strong indie book. It's nice to have that after a couple of what I can really only describe as duds that I really just couldn't honestly talk about. Yeah, sorry, I just got Karsten was saying in chat, will you be able to read and review Sonic the Hedgehog or My Hero Academia? We can talk about that stuff. The problem with those series is like those are big, huge, complicated like things to get into. So it's hard to get a solid jumping on point, but I will make a note of it. There are soft requests for Sonic the Hedgehog out there already. I just they're not priority requests or anything like that, but I will make a note of it to do some work. I don't know anything about My Hero Academia, to be honest. Well, I at least know a little bit about the Sonic comics and can talk a bit about those in some capacity or another. So I'll make a note of that. And yeah, I think we'll leave it at there. It's a fun trade. I certainly recommend. It's definitely worth your time on the whole. But beyond that, we're going to move on to what is next? Oh, yes. Something that I was teasing before, and a Marvel comic that I'm quite looking forward to talking about because it's a series we haven't talked about at all that I'd like to spend a little bit of time discussing on the whole. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, guys, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.